For hundreds of years, humans had walked among the stars not as conquerors, but as listeners, diplomats, and artists. When they joined the Galactic Accord, many feared the rise of a new warlike power, but those fears faded quickly. Unlike other species that had once battled for territory and pride, the humans brought stories, music, poetry, and questions that made even the most logic-bound minds stop and reflect. Where others brought strategy, the humans brought song. Where others marked borders with fleets, humans marked theirs with gardens, peaceful stations, and open skies. Across 1,000 worlds, the Terran name became one of calm presence, always nearby, never threatening. It was said that humans could settle the fiercest dispute with a conversation, and that they held a strange kind of power not found in weapons, but in their refusal to use them. But peace, however deep, does not stop the hungry. From the dark, edge of the Persean Drift came a new species, the Orcs. Broad-shelled, fast-breeding, and ambitious beyond measure, they saw the Accord as weak, tangled in rules and endless meetings. Without warning, they began to claim unaligned worlds in the frontier, quiet places that had once been too far or too small for the larger powers to notice. The Orcs moved fast, planting banners, building fortresses, and broadcasting their presence without shame. Most species grumbled, but only a few dared to act. As the Orcs pushed deeper, one question grew louder in every council chamber and diplomatic hall. How far would they go? The council soon expected resistance. The Kelton fleet stirred, the Uran sent warnings, the Dralna repositioned their border ships. And then, eyes turned toward Earth. Surely the humans, protectors of small colonies and allies to the border species, would object, but they did not. Their diplomats gave polite nods. Their stations remained quiet. Their ambassadors smiled and continued attending meetings, saying little and promising nothing. They watched, they listened, they took notes, but they did not act. At first, younger species assumed it was weakness. Perhaps the humans were afraid. Perhaps their history of peace had left them soft. But the older races, those who remembered, the time before the Accord, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some of them had longer memories than they admitted. There were stories, old ones, barely shared anymore, about the time before humans entered the interstellar stage. Tales of a war that never officially happened, of entire systems that had gone silent not from weapons, but from something deeper and far more unsettling. The records from those days were incomplete, as if erased. What remained were only fragments, words like containment and reconstruction, and warnings never fully explained. Those elders remembered that the humans had arrived after something, not during it, and they had never once explained what it was. Now, as the Orcs swept into minor human-allied regions and the Terrans remained silent, the whispers began. Quiet, nervous questions passed through encrypted channels and private calls. Why weren't the humans reacting? Why were they only observing? What were they waiting for? Among the seasoned tacticians, the silence was not comforting. It was chilling. One Uran scholar remarked, "A species that teaches peace so well must have first learned war too deeply." Another, a retired Kelton general, said nothing, only frowned and sent for old records locked away beneath a layer of dust. Meanwhile, Earth said nothing. Their ships remained in port. Their embassies stayed open. Their music still played, though those who listened closely said it had changed. Subtle, but present. A new tone, darker than before, woven beneath the notes. As the Orcs celebrated their latest conquest, just 3 sectors from an ancient Terran observatory, the humans finally did something unusual. They looked up and watched. The Orcs expanded their grip on the frontier, crossing into a human-aligned colony on the outer rim. Something strange began to stir across the galaxy. Their aggressive march wasn't just about power, It was about defiance, a challenge to the very foundation of the Galactic Accord. But still, Earth said nothing. No fleets were mobilized, no ambassadors rushed to the rescue, no messages of solidarity came from the Terran Union. The galaxy watched in anticipation, expecting at least a statement, a response, or some sign of action from the humans. But all they got were empty corridors and silent halls. The Galactic Council grew uneasy. They had watched the Orcs in advance, unchecked, for too long. Tensions were rising on every side, and yet humanity remained still. Envoys were sent to Earth with urgency, hoping to stir the ancient power that lay dormant in their allies. But when the diplomats arrived, all they were greeted with were 3 simple words: "We are observing." Nothing more. No promises. No plans. Only a quiet certainty that unnerved the counselors, especially the younger species who had only known peace between the stars. The Orcs had invaded a world aligned with the humans, and yet nothing moved. The youngest members of the Accord, the ones who believed that the galaxy was a place of endless cooperation and diplomacy, began to murmur doubts. Was the Terran Union truly as peaceful as they had claimed? Were they no longer a reliable ally? But the elders, those who remembered the galaxy before the humans entered the stage, began to shift nervously in their seats. They knew something the younger ones did not. They had heard the stories. Far beneath the surface of the Galactic Council, in secret archives that only the oldest races dared to access, the records began to stir. They were dusty, old, and hidden in layers of encryption that only the most trusted species could break. These ancient archives, long sealed, held forgotten histories, histories of a time before humanity became part of the galactic family, before their name was even known, and what they revealed was terrifying. The records spoke of a war fought by humans alone, when they were not yet part of the Galactic Accord, when they were still a young species discovering the stars. But this war was different from anything the galaxy had ever seen. It wasn't a war fought with weapons or fleets alone. It was a war fought with something far more profound, far more dangerous. And the most unsettling part of the story was that no one, not even the most seasoned military tacticians, wanted to talk about it. The records were cryptic, with gaps and incomplete data, but they all ended with the same chilling statement. The first and only time they went to war, they unmade the sky. The phrase sent a shiver through the council. Unmade the sky. What did that even mean? What kind of power could a species have that could undo the very fabric of space itself? The youngest species laughed nervously at the notion, dismissing it as superstition or ancient myth. But the older races, the ones with longer memories, were not so easily swayed. They remembered the stories, the legends of the Terran War, and they knew there was something behind those words. They had seen the look in the humans' eyes when they said they were observing. It wasn't the look of a passive observer, but of something waiting, something holding back, something contained. The council began to question if they had underestimated humanity all these years. The young species saw a species too peaceful to act, too focused on diplomacy to fight. But the older races knew better. The humans had shown restraint, a controlled, calculated patience that sent a clear message. They were not afraid to fight, but only if they had to. And that was what terrified the galaxy. What if they had to? What if this was the moment? What if the silence was not weakness, but a warning? Across the stars, whispers spread like wildfire. The Orcs, growing bolder with each passing day, did not understand what they were up against. They thought humanity's silence was an invitation to take more, to push further, to claim more worlds. But the older races, those who had witnessed the rise of the Terran species, knew that something far more dangerous was coming. They understood that the day the humans chose to act was a day that could reshape the galaxy itself. The young species, eager for peace and certainty, couldn't grasp the magnitude of the Terran restraint. They couldn't understand why every species in the galaxy, except the Arxen, was holding its breath. The galaxy was on the brink. The silence before the storm was deafening. And the question lingered: would humanity ever break their silence? And if they did, what would the galaxy be left with when they finally decided to act? The tipping point came when the Arxen made their boldest move yet. Without warning, they crossed the line that humanity had once drawn in the stars, claiming a long-abandoned Terran outpost in the Orion cluster. It was a place of scientific study, forgotten by most, but to the Terrans, it was a symbol, a reminder of their history of exploration, of curiosity, of a time when their reach had barely touched the edges of the galaxy. Now, it was in the hands of the Arxen. The outpost had no strategic value. It was a research facility, nothing more. But the message was clear. The Arxen would take anything, even what had once been human. For the first time, the galaxy waited to see what humanity would do. Would they finally act? Would they defend what was theirs? Every species had expected a swift response, a show of power from the Terran Union. But as the days passed, it became clear. No response was coming. The eyes silenced the patience. It was unshakable. Then, without warning, something began to stir in the depths of space. The galactic networks, buzzing with growing anxiety, picked up an unexpected signal, a ripple in the void. Deep space beacons, dormant for over 5 centuries, flared to life. The beacons were ancient relics, hidden across Terran space, left dormant since humanity had first joined the Accord. They hadn't been used in generations, and no one had expected them to activate again. But as they flickered to life, a sense of urgency filled the air. It wasn't just a few beacons, it was all of them. Every single one. Hundreds of lights in the deep dark of space that had not been seen since the early days of human expansion. And then, without explanation, the entire Terran fleet moved. No announcement, no fanfare, just the sudden, undeniable presence of human ships shifting across the stars. Civilian fleets once at rest were now in motion. Diplomatic missions were hastily recalled. The symbols of Terran peace, their cultural broadcasts, their art, their music, went silent. For the first time in centuries, the stars fell quiet. The peaceful hum of human cultural transmission, which had been a constant presence across the galaxy, faded into nothing. No songs, no broadcasts, no messages. Nothing but silence. The reaction across the Galactic Council was immediate and unsettling. The younger species, those who had never known anything but peace, began to panic. They had seen the humans as a force for harmony, for balance. But now they were preparing for something different. The older races, those who had witnessed the history of humanity, grew even more uneasy. They had lived through the last great conflict, the one that no one spoke of, and they remembered the consequences. They knew that when humans were silent, it was not a sign of weakness, but of something far more dangerous. In the halls of the Draal, a veteran tactician stood with her young apprentice, watching the Terran movements unfold across the monitors. The apprentice was puzzled, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why aren't they fighting back?" he asked. "Why not send a fleet to reclaim their outpost?" The old tactician studied the data in silence for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she watched the patterns. The young apprentice waited for her answer, his mind racing with questions. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the veteran spoke, her words carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "They aren't preparing to fight," she said, her voice steady but filled with an unmistakable tension. "They're preparing to end the fight." The apprentice froze, the words sinking in like a heavy weight. His mind raced, trying to process what she meant. But there was no time to ask further. The silence in the galaxy grew thicker, The humans were no longer a passive species. They were preparing for something, and whatever it was coming. The Arxen, who had thought they could take anything from the Terrans without consequence, had just unknowingly crossed the most dangerous line of all. And now, humanity's silence was the storm before the tempest. What the galaxy had once seen as a peaceful species was now poised to unleash something far more powerful than anyone could imagine. In that quiet, uneasy moment, every species knew the truth. There was no such thing as a harmless human, not when they decided to act. And now, humanity was about to remind the stars why they had once been feared. The galaxy had never witnessed anything like it. The Arxen, emboldened by their unchecked advances, were sure of their victory. They had taken the Terran outpost, challenged humanity's silence, and pushed further into regions they once avoided. But now, in a shocking turn of events, humanity did the impossible. They did not respond with weapons. They did not raise a fleet. No shots were fired. Instead, the humans wove a quiet, yet unbreakable web around the Arxen, using the very systems they had once built to connect and communicate. First, the Arxen's communication systems went dark. It wasn't an attack. It was something far more subtle. Every message, every signal they tried to send, vanished into the void. Their fleet commanders were unable to reach one another. Orders were lost in transit. Their military networks, built on advanced quantum technology, began to deteriorate, their connections unraveling as if someone had simply flicked a switch. Then, the trade networks that had been vital to the Arxen's expansion began to disappear. Entire supply lines collapsed. Overnight, systems once brimming with energy and resources now stood silent, their vital connections severed. The Arxen fleets, once coordinated and purposeful, now floated aimlessly in space, their crews bewildered and helpless, unable to receive orders or make any move without their communication systems. Meanwhile, in every corner of Terran space, a quiet shift occurred. Every system connected to Earth, every satellite, every AI, every signal, suddenly went dark. The silence that had once been so unnerving became deafening. The galaxy had no way of knowing what was happening behind the walls of the Terran Union. But one thing was clear. Humanity had put an end to the Arxen's ability to wage war. Not with weapons, not with bombs or ships, but with a profound, near unnatural control over the flow of information itself. The Arxen were isolated. They could not communicate, could not trade, could not function. And then, as the galaxy held its breath, humanity sent a message. It was not a threat, nor a demand. It was a lesson. Through their vast network of AI satellites, humanity broadcast a single message in every language known to the galaxy. This is your final lesson. War is not our nature, but peace, when broken, becomes our purpose. The words echoed through the vastness of space, a reminder of the power that had once been feared but was now rarely seen. The message wasn't a call for revenge. It wasn't a rallying cry for war. It was a statement of fact. When pushed too far, humanity would not retaliate with violence, but with something far more devastating: the complete removal of the reason for conflict itself. They had neutralized the Arxen's power without a single shot. It was the perfect countermeasure. The galaxy trembled at the quiet precision of it. The Arxen were left with nothing, no means of communication, no access to their resources, and no way of making progress. In the council chambers, panic began to set in. Members from all over the galaxy, once certain that humanity's pacifism was a sign of weakness, now felt a cold dread creeping over them. They turned to one another, seeking answers, but no one had them. How had the humans done this? And more importantly, why? They had won. The Arxen were immobilized, defeated without a single loss of life. The Terrans had proven their dominance, but in a way no one had expected. The Council, desperate for some form of negotiation, sent envoys to Earth, pleading for humanity to show restraint, to allow for peaceful talks to resolve the situation. The Orcs, now completely helpless, echoed these pleas. They begged for terms, for a way to negotiate, to re-enter the fold without facing complete annihilation. Finally, humanity spoke again, but not through military might, not through a fleet of ships or a show of force. They sent a single envoy, a lone human, walking into the council chambers without weapons, without an army, without anything but a small, unassuming device. When the envoy activated the device, a soft melodic hum filled the room. It wasn't just a song. It was a recording, one that had been created centuries ago, a sound so pure, so haunting, that it carried the weight of human history in every note. As the melody played, the council members sat in stunned silence, moved to tears by the beauty, the sadness, and the power of the music. It was a reminder of what humanity stood for, a culture that had the power to move the stars, not with bombs or swords, but with harmony, with understanding, with a singular truth, that peace, once broken, could be restored in the most unexpected of ways. The Orcs had been defeated, not through war, but through the unyielding strength of the human doctrine, the power of total peace. The surrender came without fanfare, without the clash of weapons or the roar of battle. The Orcs, once a powerful and expanding empire, folded as quietly as it had arrived. There were no conquered worlds to parade, no cities left in ruins, no territory to claim. They simply stopped. Their fleets, once filled with purpose, hung in space like drifting ghosts, disconnected from their once fearsome network. Their soldiers, lost in the vast emptiness, had no orders to follow, no cause to fight for. Their entire empire, one that had seemed unstoppable just weeks before, collapsed in the face of a force no weapon could defeat: human resolve. They had not been overpowered. They had not been crushed. The Orcs were not destroyed by might, but by something far more insidious: the complete disarmament of their will to fight. Humanity's strategy had been one of information, of understanding, of kindness, and a psychological warfare that no one had expected. In the vast, quiet spaces where weapons and warships once filled the air with tension, now there was only the weight of peace, a peace that the Orcs couldn't fight. Human systems had blocked the flow of their communications, isolated them from their allies, and rendered their military networks useless. The Orcs had been stripped of their power, not through force, but through a kind of quiet persuasion that made fighting seem pointless. The will to conquer, the drive to fight for more, dissolved like smoke in the air, leaving only the empty space of lost ambition. The surrender was complete. No one had expected it, least of all the Orcs themselves. How could they have? For centuries, the galaxy had been shaped by war, by armies, by strategy, by violence. The idea that a species could dismantle an empire without firing a single shot was unfathomable. Yet, humanity had done it. Without a single weapon, without so much as a battle cry, they had reduced the Orcs to nothing, and as their empire crumbled, the galaxy watched in stunned silence. The council exhaled in relief, unsure whether to cheer or to shudder. Peace had returned. The Orcs were no more. The threat had been neutralized. The galaxy could breathe again. But one thing lingered in the air, something darker, something that no one dared to voice aloud. The fear wasn't gone. No, the fear had simply changed shape. It wasn't fear of human wrath. That had never been the concern. The Terran Union had never shown interest in conquering, never shown signs of seeking revenge. They had no desire to destroy or dominate. It was something else. Something far more unsettling. The fear was of human resolve. It is said among the oldest races of the galaxy that humans do not have a war doctrine because they do not need one. There is no need for a doctrine of violence when one has the ability to make violence unnecessary. If the humans go to war, it is not for conquest or power, but for something far more profound, to remind every species of a terrible truth that they would rather forget. A truth that hangs in the air, unnoticed by most, until it is too late. Humanity does not destroy worlds. They do not obliterate entire civilizations with weapons of mass destruction. What humanity destroys, what they truly have the power to annihilate, is the very reason for war itself. They unmake the drive for conflict, the thirst for power, the need for violence. They strip away the causes of war as easily as one might peel back a layer of paint. They make the desire to fight feel empty, unnecessary, even absurd. And once that seed is planted in the minds of their enemies, once they strip away the fuel that feeds war, there is nothing left to do but surrender. This is why every species in the galaxy dreads the day humans go to war. Not because they are violent, but because they are not. Because when they decide to act, it is not for glory, not for pride. It is to show the galaxy that war itself is the greatest enemy, and that no species, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of breaking peace. Humanity doesn't need to wield a weapon to win. They simply need to remind everyone that peace, once broken, becomes their purpose. And that is a force more powerful than any weapon in the universe. And so, the galaxy holds its breath. Peace is fragile. The lesson has been learned.